Welcome to this explainer. If you've ever watched the financial headlines and wondered why on earth central bankers, politicians, and academics are constantly arguing over interest rates, stimulus checks, and inflation, well, you are basically watching a century-old intellectual boxing match. When your groceries suddenly cost 20% more, or a friend unexpectedly loses their job, you are feeling the direct, real-world impacts of this exact debate. Today, we're going to explore the fundamental clash in macroeconomic theory that defines our modern world, the battle between the Austrian school and Keynesian economics. And to be clear, we aren't here to pick a winner, we're just here to thoroughly understand the fascinating frameworks they both use to diagnose the economy.
It really all boils down to one ultimate economic dilemma. When a recession hits, when businesses close and unemployment spikes, should the government step in with massive spending and central bank intervention? Or should it just step aside and let the market organically correct itself? When disaster strikes, brilliant experts violently disagree on the fix, and the way a nation answers this very question directly dictates your taxation levels, your risk of unemployment, and the purchasing power of your entire life savings.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for the explainer. We'll start by meeting the key thinkers. Then we'll break down their core principles. After that, we'll look at the anatomy of an economic boom and what happens when the inevitable bust hits. Finally, we'll examine their ultimate battleground, the Great Depression, and wrap up with why this debate is still so relevant today.
All right, part 1. Meet the thinkers.
First up, we have the heavyweights of the Austrian school. The distinct identity of this framework was largely forged by Ludwig von Mises. He was the one who deeply integrated money and credit into the whole business cycle. And right alongside him is his famous student, Friedrich Hayek. Hayek is a towering figure here, though his Nobel Prize in economics didn't actually arrive until 1974, which honestly shows just how long it took for his theories to get formal global recognition after Keynesianism absolutely dominated the mid-20th century. These thinkers, along with Haber and Rothbard, firmly believe that free markets left completely to their own devices are inherently stable.
Let's move to see how this all builds over time. Back in 1871, Karl Menger essentially founded the Austrian school with his book, Principles of Economics, completely revolutionizing how we understand value. Fast forward to 1912, and Mises expands on this with his theory of money and credit. But then, the world gets rocked by the Great Depression. Enter the British economist John Maynard Keynes. In 1936, Keynes dropped the general theory of employment, interest, and money. And this wasn't just some dry textbook. This was a paradigm-shifting alternative born directly out of the sheer desperation of a decade where traditional economic theories seemed to be completely failing the millions of people standing in breadlines.
Moving on to Section 2, Core Principles.
For the Austrians, absolutely everything begins with the individual. It's a concept known as methodological individualism. They rely on something called praxeology, basically the study of human action. Austrians argue that groups, governments, collectives, they don't actually think or act. Only individuals do based on their own highly subjective values. Think of it like your local coffee shop. An Austrian economist isn't looking at some generalized national coffee market. They're looking at you, the individual, subjectively deciding that a specific latte is worth exactly $5 to you on a random Tuesday morning. Therefore, the economy is a highly complex, bottom-up process of individuals making billions of unique choices over time.
Keynesians, on the flip side, look at the economy from a top-down, macroeconomic perspective. Their big focus is on aggregate demand, meaning the total spending by consumers, businesses, and the government. To contrast our coffee shop example, the Keynesian looks at the economy more like a giant bathtub. They don't really care about the individual drops of water, they care about the total water level. That's aggregate demand. If the water gets too low, well, the government needs to step in and turn on the fiscal faucet. Keynes basically introduced a largely capital-free macroeconomics, where the primary concern is just managing these broad aggregates to keep the engine running.
And this brilliantly illustrates just how opposite these two frameworks are. The Austrians laser focus on individual action and production. They believe you fundamentally cannot consume something before it's actually produced, and they see the market as inherently stable. Keynesians, however, focus on aggregate demand and consumption. They view the market as volatile, prone to erratic swings, and believe that overall economic health is totally driven by total spending levels at any given moment.
Which brings us to Section 3, Anatomy of a Boom.
So it all hinges on how you view the interest rate. For Austrians, the interest rate is arguably the single most important price in the entire economy. It is literally the price of time itself. It represents this natural, organic balance between people's real desire to save and the time it takes to produce goods. Keynesians, though, they view the interest rate primarily as a policy lever. It's a mechanical tool. something for central banks to strategically lower or raise to stimulate spending, manage investment, and keep that aggregate demand bathtub filled right to the brim.
The Austrians argue that when a central bank steps in and artificially lowers interest rates through credit expansion, it sends a dangerously false signal to the entire market. Suddenly, entrepreneurs borrow all this seemingly cheap money and kick off massive long-term projects. Imagine a developer deciding to build a sprawling luxury resort in the middle of the desert simply because the bank handed out a 0% loan. Sure, it creates construction jobs and it looks like a massive economic boom today, and this is key because the real consumer savings aren't actually there to back it up. It's what Austrians call malinvestment. It's an illusion. When reality sets in and rates eventually have to rise, that desert resort project completely collapses because the underlying consumer demand was just never there to begin with.
That leads us right into Section 4, when the bust hits. Here is the stark contrast in how they view downturns. For the Austrian school, the recession isn't the disease, it's actually the cure. A recession is basically an economic hangover. It's painful, sure, but absolutely necessary to purge the bad decisions and misallocated capital from that artificial boom. It's the economy trying to aggressively rebalance itself. Now, for the Keynesian, the recession isn't a hangover, it's a sudden, irrational illness that needs immediate medicine. They see it as being caused by a sharp, harmful drop in aggregate demand and private spending.
Keynes famously argued that investment spending is highly unstable because it's driven by psychological factors. He actually coined the very colorful term animal spirits for this. Basically, human emotion and panic dictate the markets. If businesses get spooked by sudden uncertainty, their animal spirits turn pessimistic. So what do? They stop investing, they hoard cash, they lay off workers. Those fired workers then lose their incomes, so they immediately stop buying things. This creates what Keynes called a general glut, where demand completely fails to meet supply, leading to a vicious, self-perpetuating downward spiral of runaway unemployment. And left alone, Keynes warned, the market might just stay stuck in that depression indefinitely.
All right, Section 5, the Great Depression Battle.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how Keynes actively pushed for massive state intervention. In 1933, he wrote an open letter to President Franklin D. Roosevelt, and he certainly did not mince words. He laid overwhelming emphasis on the increase of purchasing power by governmental authority. His stance was that since the private sector was completely paralyzed by pessimism, only the federal government had the sheer power and borrowing capacity to step in, run massive deficits, and artificially inject purchasing power back into the economy to restart the engine. Actually, as an amazing historical side note here, despite being fierce intellectual rivals battling over the fate of the global economy, Hayek and Keynes were quite friendly. During World War II, they even shared air raid watch duties together on the roof of King's College in Cambridge, acting as friendly pen pals while debating these exact theories in the dark. Kind of wild to think about. So the ultimate policy clash during the 1930s was fiercely drawn. On one side, Hayek and the Austrians argued for the complete avoidance of government interference. They warned that trying to artificially prop up prices and wages or pumping more cheap money into the system would literally just delay the necessary market liquidation and prolong the suffering. On the other side, Keynesians argued the exact opposite. The government absolutely must implement aggressive fiscal policies like public works and massive tax shifts, and central banks must use monetary policy to force money into the system, totally regardless of the deficit. And finally, Section 6, the enduring debate. So the crucial point is that this debate ultimately centers on the fundamental role of the state. Keynesians firmly believe that government intervention through central bank rate manipulation and federal stimulus cures the volatile extremes of the business cycle. The Austrian school counters that this very government fine-tuning and manipulation of the money supply is actually the original cause of the booms and busts. Intervene to cure it or intervene and cause it.
We still live entirely in the shadow of this debate today. Just look at the 2008 financial crisis, where central banks slashed rates to zero, or the massive trillion-dollar government stimulus checks injected directly into the economy during the COVID-19 pandemic. A Keynesian looks at that and argues that this aggressive, necessary medicine prevented a global depression and saved millions of jobs from being permanently lost to panic. An Austrian looks at the crushing, historic waves of inflation that followed and argues that this medicine was actually poison, creating a massive bubble of malinvestment and currency debasement that we are painfully paying for today through higher prices and unstable markets. So I'll leave you with this. Observe the markets, look at the actions of your government, and ask yourself which economic theory best explains the world we live in today. Keep learning and keep questioning.